Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. My name is Andi Shafiya. Today I will be presenting to you my proposal titled Speech Acts in John Musk's directed movie Moana. Now, first let's talk about the importance, urgency, and the feasibility and novelty for my research. Now, first is importance. So speech acts are very crucial in understanding language and culture. Now, since Moana is widely viewed worldwide, analyzing its dialogue helps us understand how cultural values are communicated through language. Next is the urgency. Now, there is an increasing demand for more accurate cultural representation in media. More studies are being conducted on linguistic diversity, and which makes this research especially relevant on our modern day today. Now, this research is also highly feasible since Moana is readily available with a lot of dialogue transcripts that can be accessed for analysis. Now, additionally, speech act theory provides a very strong framework for categorizing and interpreting the data. Finally, there is the novelty. So the novelty of this research is that there has been a lot of research, speech act researches done on real life situations and in a lot of forms of literature, but very few focus on animated films. Now, the study will bridge the gap between linguistics, cultural studies, and media analysis. And together, these four factors demonstrate why this research is valuable, timely, and achievable. Now, next is the core of my study revolves around two key research questions. First is, what role do speech acts play in the movie Moana? So, for example, how does Moana's speech reflect her leadership role, and how does Maui's dialogue establish his identity? Next is, how does Moana use these speech acts to represent Polynesian traditions? Now, this includes aspects such as respect for elders, oral storytelling, and also leadership dynamics in the film. Now, from these research questions, I have established two primary objectives. The first is to analyze how speech acts influence characters' relationships in Moana. Analyze how speech acts influence characters' relationships in Moana. Though this means looking at how speech acts like requests, commands, and expressions of gratitude define social roles within the movie. And the second objective is to evaluate how speech acts serve as a bridge between language and culture. Now, this will help us understand how dialogue in Moana reflects Polynesian traditions and whether the film effectively communicates these cultural values to a more global audience. Finally, this research is very significant in multiple ways. Now, first, it contributes to a lot of linguistics studies by expanding speech acts analysis beyond traditional settings and applying it to animated films. And in terms of cultural studies, it also helps analyze how films like Moana can represent less popular cultures, indigenous cultures, through dialogue. And from a media and education perspective, it can be useful for educators and media analysts or filmmakers who want to understand how animated films teach cultural values to audiences worldwide, especially young audiences. Next is the theoretical background. Now, for my theoretical background, I have created a pyramid chart. So the pyramid chart represents the theoretical framework of my research, which shows how different linguistic and cultural concepts build upon each other to analyze speech acts in Moana. Now, at the foundation, we have sociolinguistics, which studies how language functions in society. This is important when analyzing how characters in Moana use language differently based on their role, such as a leader addressing their people, versus casual conversations between friends. Now, the second layer is speech act theory, which is developed by J.L. Austin and John Searle. Now, this theory explains that language does more than just communicate, it performs actions. So when a character in Moana makes a promise, gives an order, or apologizes, they are not just speaking, they are doing something with their words. Now, understanding these speech acts will allow us to see how language shapes character relationships and cultural identity. And then on the third layer, we have pragmatics. Now, this studies how meaning is shaped by context, intention, and social norms. So a direct command in one culture might be considered rude, while in another it might be just more normal. So in Moana, characters use different speech acts depending on their relationships and cultural expectations, like Moana speaking more formally to her father, Chief Tui, but using a more informal and challenging tone with Maui. And then we have the fourth layer, which is language and culture plus cultural representation. Now, language is not just a communication tool, it also reflects traditions, values, and beliefs. Now, the way a culture expresses leadership, storytelling, or respect is often embedded in its language. So Moana provides an interesting case study because it uses speech acts to introduce audiences to Polynesian traditions, social hierarchies, and mythology. And finally, at the top of the pyramid, we have identities, power, and speech acts in Moana. This is where everything comes together. So how language is used to identify, to define somebody's identity, establish power dynamics, and reinforce cultural heritage in the film. Now, this theoretical framework provides a more structured approach to analyzing speech acts are influenced by culture and how they shape characters, relationships, and identities in Moana. By breaking it down layer by layer, we understand how language is more than just words, but is also a powerful tool for cultural storytelling. So slide 5 shows my theoretical framework. It is pretty much the same as the pyramid, except it goes from sociolinguistics, speech acts, pragmatics, language and culture, cultural representation, and then finally identities, power, and speech act. Next is the research design for my project. Now, the type of the research type that I will be using is a qualitative research design following a discourse analysis of Moana's dialogue, while the methodology that I will be using is based on the speech act theory, based on the speech act theory of J.L. Austin and Searle, and I will be identifying cultural elements in speech acts and using discourse analysis to really get into that dialogue. Next is the source of data. For the source of data, I will be using two main types of data, the primary and secondary sources. The primary data comes from the film Moana, which I will be analyzing specific dialogues where characters use speech acts to interact with each other that are related to leadership, respect, identity and tradition, and family. So these conversations will be then carefully transcribed and categorized based on the different speech act categories. And then for the secondary data to support my analysis, I will be using a lot of data from various linguistic studies, cultural research, and media analysis. This includes key works on speech act theory, Polynesian culture, and cultural representation in animated films. Next is the data collection procedure. So first, I will be watching the movie Moana multiple times to pay close attention to key dialogues that involve the topics, the main points that I would like to study. And then I will be transcribing the dialogue to ensure an accurate analysis. Every speech act, including commands, requests, promises, apologies, will be documented on my research. And then point 3 is to categorize the speech acts based on the categories developed by John Searle, such as directives, expressives, commissives, declarations, and etc. And then finally, I will interpret these speech acts within a cultural framework, which compares them to real-world Polynesian traditions to see how accurately the film represents them. Next is the data analysis. So once the data is collected, the next step is the analysis. Now, this process follows a 5-step method to ensure clarity and depth. First, I will transcribe the dialogue from the film. Then I will deconstruct the dialogue, which means that it will be broken down into speech act categories, and then I will be reassembling them and noticing what patterns that will appear in their dialogue, and then I will interpret how these speech acts reflect Polynesian cultural norms. And then finally, the study will draw conclusions on how Moana portrays cultural identity through speech acts and what this means for media representation of Indigenous culture. And then by following this structured approach, the research will provide highly valuable insights into how animated films use language to shape cultural narratives. And for the references that I used, mainly I used Austin, How to Do Things with Words, and John Searle's Expression and Meaning Studies in the Theory of Speech Acts. So yes, that is the presentation for my proposal. Thank you so much for listening. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.